Introduction to weak or irregular verbs. Well, we're now making the transition to weak verbs. We've studied the strong verbs. Those are the verbs on page 544 and 545 of Ross's paradigm charts at the back of his book. We studied them in all the binyan now, kal, and then nifal, piel, puel, hitpal, hifil, and hofal. Now we're going to study the rest of the charts at the back of his book. Well, we're going to go through his chapters, but we're going to be covering the material in these charts and a bit more. And these verbs are called weak verbs because they have weak letters as roots. One or more of these will be weak. So if this represents our three roots, our three radicals, 1, 2, 3, then the weak verbs are the ones that have weak letters as one of the radicals. And the weak letters that we're concerned about are gutturals, aleph, nun, vav and yud, and hey. And I'll put hey down here. We consider hey separately from the gutturals because it has special properties. Now, the way we designate this is position 1, this is position 2, and this is position 3. So if we have a nun here in the first position, then we would call that, let me just write this in here, we call that first nun. A first nun verb. And it is in the first position that the nun causes the verb to be weak. It does different things here in the first position. If you have a nun in the middle, it doesn't matter. It just behaves like a normal, strong letter. So it's not the weak letters in any position, it's the weak letters in particular positions. And if you look at the back of Ross there, this is at his chart, starting from page 546, you'll see at the top of each chart the name of the type of weak verb that he's featuring on that page. So for instance, on page 546, it says first guttural verbs. So that would mean that we have a guttural sitting here. Too many pages here. So if you have a guttural sitting here, that's what first guttural means. Okay? And so first aleph means you have an aleph in the first position. Second guttural would be here. First nun would be over here, etc. Now, there is an older designation, the way they used to talk about these things. They used to name them. Let me just get rid of this here, make myself some room. And that is to use the paradigm verb pa'al. Now we saw this before when we looked at the names of the binyan, the binyanim. The name PL, for instance, is just the verb pa'al in the perfect 3ms. So we have hidik there, and we have a tsere there, PL. Well, this same verb, the same paradigm verb, is used to name these types of weak verbs. And the way you would name it, let me get rid of this guy too. Let's say we have, here's my brush. Say we have nun there. We're using the scheme that Ross uses, which is the more modern scheme, is to call this first nun. In the older scheme, this would be called a pei nun. Pei, and this is abbreviation here, pei nun. Okay? That's because the nun is in the pei position here. Pei is the first radical in this paradigm word. If it was a medial vav, a vav here in the middle, then you'd call it an ayin vav. Ayin vav. Or if there was a hey at the end, for instance, then you would call that lamed hey. Anyway, you may run into some textbooks that use this nomenclature, so that's why I'm showing you what it is, so you understand what's going on there. But we'll be referring to it by the first, second, third, and then giving the weak letter in question. Now, we kind of have two sets. If you take a look at the back of Ross, the first 2 pages are your strong verbs, page 544 and 545 in my edition. Then he's got some gutturals, 546, 547. So he's got first guttural, first aleph, second guttural. Now there are third gutturals as well, but the change is not that significant, so he doesn't bother to put a chart at the back. Then starting on page 549, he's got first nun, and then first vav, first yud, third hey, then something called the hollow verbs. The hollow verbs are verbs that have either a vav or a yud in the middle here. We'll look at those in more detail a little later. And then he's got geminates, which is the last chart. Geminates are where you have the last two radicals. I should get rid of this here so as not to confuse you. The last two radicals are the same. Gemini means twin, so when you have the last two radicals the same, they have special features. So those are the weak verbs. Now the gutturals are kind of, some people don't call them weak verbs because the guttural itself does not change. It just changes the vowels. But with these other ones, you can get changes to the consonant as well as the vowels. Okay, what else did I want to say by way of intro? Okay, the other thing here is if you look at a chart, just pick any chart pretty much. Let's look at the first nuns on page 549. We'll notice that he's got a column for cal. In fact, he's got 4 different columns for cal, so there's lots of variation within cal for first nun. And he's got nifal, hifil, and hofal, but there's no pl there. Why not? Well, the reason is because pl is regular in the first nun. A first nun, get rid of these again. First nun verb is not irregular in the pl. Your nun is sitting here. The pl involves this position here, and as it turns out, the nun doesn't behave oddly in the pl because all the activity is happening over here. So, all I'm trying to say here is that for weak verbs in the charts at the back, not all the binyan are featured, and that's because either they don't exist in a particular binyan, or it's strong or reasonably strong, and so they don't bother to list it. Okay. Anything else? Talked about the nomenclature, and not all binyan are affected. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to look at all these different weak verbs. And again, this is somewhat encyclopedic in nature, lots of detail. If you look through Ross in these chapters, you'll see paradigm after paradigm after paradigm. What I'm going to try to do is present it in a systematic fashion, a little bit at a time. This isn't something you want to memorize this whole thing. If you want to know how to approach this, then go back to the module where I talked about strategies for learning verbs. Basically, what I'm suggesting is to learn the principal parts for the weak verbs. But it is important to gain a sense for how these things function. And if you go through this, then at least you're aware that there's something going on with first nuns, or hollow verbs or whatever. And you've been through the material once, you can come back and you can look at it again, or you can look it up in a book. So when you encounter it in reading, you at least know that there's some issue and you can go look it up. Okay, so let's turn now to the details of weak verbs.